Thank you very much. This is not scheduled, but I thought I'd better address this since it just came up. Just read a tweet. You may have seen that I shared this on the CSS Day hashtag. I'm just going to read it out to you if you haven't heard it already. It goes like this. Let's be honest and stick to the roots. HTML and CSS are not programming languages. Don't stick inclusion to this. If I can turn a screw into something, doesn't mean I'm a mechanican. HTML is just a dumb document format, and CSS is just a dumb style format. Okay, so I'm going to break this down into its constituent parts. The first sentence, let's be honest and stick to the roots. This is an entirely meaningless sentence. It doesn't, think about it, if someone said that to you, if they said, let's be honest and stick to the roots, you'd be like, what? What do you mean by that? HTML and CSS are not programming languages. HTML and CSS are literally things that you write for a computer. You instruct computers with these things. If they're not programming languages, then nothing is a programming language. Don't stick inclusion to this. This is particularly interesting, this part of the tweet, because I think he's confused inclusion, which is an abstract noun, with the proprietary adhesive Velcro. At least that's how it seems to me anyway. A mechanican isn't a real thing. This is just something that someone who doesn't know how to write very well, and that's not necessarily their fault, has written. But I think even though it is a made-up nonsense thing, I think everyone here today can say that they're a mechanican if they want to. I'm a mechanican. Rachel Andrew is a mechanican. Lara's a mechanican. We're all mechanicans. You're all mechanicans. So give yourself a round of applause. Okay, so that's that covered. The Flexbox Holy Albatross. Now, first, a little bit about me. I'm not very good at this bit about me. First, I just want to say my name is Heydon. It's spelt correctly twice in my email address. Are there any recruiters here? They know better than to turn up at CSS Day. Okay, well, what you do if you're a recruiter is you put my email address, or you copy and paste it into the field where the email address goes. You look at it, and you go, Heydon, right, that's how it's spelled. And then you look at it again and go, yeah, that confirms that for me. And then you write, Dear Heydon, not Dear Haddon, Dear Aiden, or Dear Hannah. This is my favorite Pokemon. I don't know what he's called, so I just call him Carl. This is my only contribution to the HTML5 specification. It's my drawing of a crocoduck. The crocoduck was made famous by someone called Kirk Cameron, who was a children's, like a child actor, and then became an evangelical Christian. And he famously used the crocoduck to demonstrate that evolution isn't true. Because if evolution was true, at some point in evolution, the duck would have naturally evolved into a crocodile and vice versa. So I want to say that, can we stop using like ableist words like idiot, by the way? It's very easy to say that Kirk Cameron is an idiot. And wearing my accessibility hat, I don't particularly like that. He is deliberately ignorant. He has chosen, using his well-working faculties, to believe something ridiculous because it supports his ideology. This isn't really about CSS, well, you know. Anyway, so I was here in 2014, and that was actually the first ever time I did a conference talk. And I talked about, as Tab mentioned, the what's called the Lobotomized Owl Selector. Lobotomized is not like a very pleasant word, so let's get rid of that, and it's easier to say Owl Selector. And I was really interested in this construct that I kind of discovered just through working as a front-end developer. It was a handy thing, because it allowed me to style things independent of what they are. It just styled things based entirely on their context, because it's just a asterisk, a plus, and an asterisk, and it looks like an owl. And I think a lot of the talks today have been talking about this thing of thinking about context and trying to make things context-proof. And to do that, to go back to what Lara was saying, is a lot to do with kind of writing things algorithmically. So to try and kind of tell browsers or hint to browsers what they should do and allow them to make decisions based on circumstances. And that's what I'm going to talk about more today. There's some quite cute pictures of the owl selector when people do blog posts about it occasionally. That one's quite nice. This one was done by a student of Brad Westerfall. He just actually drew this on a whiteboard some time ago. Presumably, whilst Brad was trying to teach him CSS, he was ignoring him and just drawing an owl, which is a bit of a shame. Someone tried to turn it into a meme that bombed quite badly because it's too specific, let's be honest. As this super glue works just fine, writes, honestly, don't know what's going on here, and I think that's fair enough, really. So this is sort of like my second album, if you like, in terms of CSS Day. This is the Flexbox Holy Albatross. So I'm going to explain what the name means, first of all.
Albatross! Albatross!
So Flexbox, sorry about that, by the way. Flexbox, not to be confused with Sexbox, which is a British television program, literally about people having sex in a box. So they go into a box, they have sex, and then they're interviewed about their sexual relations that they had in the box. That's got nothing to do with Flexbox. It's not part of the CSS specification whatsoever. No influence there. So the Flexbox is a layout module, like Grid is a layout module. We learned a lot about the inner workings of that from Rachel earlier today. Grid does not surpass or replace Flexbox. They do different things, and that's something worth remembering. The holy part of this name is short for Holy Grail. So basically what I wanted was to solve a very specific layout problem, to write, if you like, a very specific algorithm to help a layout govern itself without my intervention. It was a holy grail because it was something I really wanted to find and get my hands on. It was something I wanted to solve and then show to people that I'd solved this problem because it kept coming up. And like the Holy Grail, the literal Holy Grail in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, I wanted to find this specific Flexbox layout before the German Nazis got to it. We don't want Flexbox to fall into the hands of the Nazis, German Nazis or any other kind of Nazis. I'm not being specific there, really. If you ever got the opportunity to work for a Nazi, even if you really like the Nazi football table that they offer you or whatever, turn that down and work for someone who isn't a Nazi. It's a keynote, so I have to give sort of broad advice about things, right? That kind of thing. The albatross part is an allusion to a poem by a rapper. It's a rap, really. A rap by a rapper called Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and he wrote this rap called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and you can tell he's a rapper because he's playfully misspelled the word rhyme, as you can see there. And
Albatross!
Oh, sorry about that. And so what he did basically is he wrote this poem about this mariner, and the mariner, he did this terrible thing, and then the sort of hung the albatross around his neck. It was like this symbol of this psychological burden. And this layout, this Flexbox Holy Albatross layout, was kind of a psychological burden on me because it felt like it was something that I was within my grasp, but I couldn't quite get to it. I felt that I'd failed myself. It took me months on and off trying to solve this problem, as small as the problem, as you'll find out, is. So on today's agenda, what the fuck are you on about, Heydon? That's the first item on the agenda today. Fair question, you know, let's be candid with each other. 2, okay, that sounds quite good actually. Sorry for swearing at you, that's fine, I don't mind. I'm not made of glass. Followed by web components maybe, because, I don't know, I mean, they're supported in Edge now, so we might as well do them. And if we have time, things that suck ass is item number 4. The problem. So let's frame the problem. This is, I read one of those, I did a course on how to do conference talks. Frame the problem first. Obviously I didn't, based on all of the shit that I've been talking so far. So the problem is, here are some things which are next to each other. They're boxes. All we do in CSS is lay out boxes. Everything is a box, as Rachel reminded us. And if you do display flex, then those boxes which are in a vertical flow direction go into a horizontal flow direction, okay? That's great, that's really handy. That wasn't something that we could easily do before Flexbox, so thank everyone who was involved in that tab, thank you. And if you do FlexSpaces Auto or FlexGrow 1 or something like that, you can make them all distribute to take up the available space. And then, let's say the FlexSpaces is a certain value like 20 rem. If there's not enough room for 3 items at that FlexSpaces to fit on the one line, if you do flex wrap, I mean, you know all this, but you get this shape here. One wraps down, and because you've got flex grow on, that goes longer. Eventually, you get down to a menu button, which is kind of weird, but you get like a vertical configuration. So they're all each on one line. But this one in the middle here is a little bit problematic because although it kind of reorganizes in a way in this sort of algorithmic, self-governing, cool way where it fills up the gaps and all of that, you've got this third item which is now longer than the first two. And in terms, if you're a user who isn't aware that this algorithmic relayout is going on, you would think to yourself, is that being treated differently on purpose? Is that more important? Is that a special thing? Why is it on its own line and why is it twice as big? So what if we could go from this first layout to this other layout? We could go from horizontal to vertical and bypass that intermediary step. And everyone immediately says to me, whenever I ask this question, they say, well, use a breakpoint. Use a breakpoint, Heydon. Use a breakpoint, Heydon. Heydon, use a breakpoint. Come on, man. Like that. And, they'll break into my house and leave Post-it notes on my fridge and telegram me just like, Heydon, stop, use a breakpoint, stop, etc. And I say invariably, no. And there are two very good reasons for this. The first reason is actually genealogical. I actually researched my family tree, and I discovered that, I think it's fairly clear from this diagram, you're not my dad, basically. You're not my dad, you're not my dad, you're not my dad, you're not my dad. You are actually my biological father, and thanks for coming to see me do a talk in Amsterdam. But that's sort of an exception to the rule. So, more pertinently, media queries are a hack. And I'll try to explain why. The reason is media queries only pertain, width-based media queries, only pertain to the viewport, the width of the viewport. My one component, because I'm building a design system, my component could appear in lots of different places. And Hakim talks brilliantly about how the different things that he did to deal with that. If it appears it can appear in a constrained space, and my media query, my width-based media query, isn't going to help there because it only talks to the viewport. I get them to flip round using a media query, but by the time I've done that, the one on the right perhaps will have got too narrow. The content will have been too squashed up. So what we want is to lay things out according to available space. And what media queries help us with is not that. So not great, really. Whenever you're writing a media query, you are intervening. You are overriding the algorithm. You're going into manual override, and that's not good. It's not tenable. You can't keep going on like that. Getting quite emotional. So container queries was something that was proposed. The idea was that you would respond to the immediate available space, the space afforded by the container element. And this is what they might have looked like. Unfortunately, though, and I don't know the technical details, Tab might be able to fill in at some point on this. Basically, when we tried to get container queries to be consumed by browsers, to be implemented, this happened. They just sort of like threw them up like sprouts, Brussels sprouts. As I say, don't know the technical details there, but that's not happening, really, at least not for the foreseeable future. So what we then do is we reach to another tool, which is something called JavaScript. And JavaScript has the name because of its unique way of handling errors. And what it does is if you make one small error, everything fucking blows up, and then you're fucked. Unlike CSS, and Jeremy writes about this very well, which is very resilient, so you make one fuck up and everything else is okay. So that's why it's called JavaScript, if you're wondering. It's also called ExmaScript. But you can use JavaScript to kind of do container queries now. Resize Observer, although it's not supported everywhere, it is coming to other browsers quite soon, is optimized for dealing with tracking dimensional changes to elements. So it is quite an efficient way of using JavaScript, even though JavaScript itself is obviously a bit brittle. And in my version of a container query, what I do is I actually translate from different units. So Resub's observer deals in pixels, but I can use a test element. I can place that inside my target element, measure it, measure the offset width, and translate between ems and pixels. And that way I can kind of, like I would with media queries, I can use whatever unit I like. That's kind of cool. But can we do this with pure CSS? Can we do container queries? If we did, then there must be something in CSS which kind of, there's a switch, something happens, something distinct would have to happen in this mid position to flip from one thing to another without the natural kind of flow of things happening. Something would have to intercept it for us because we're not there to do it. Kind of like literally a switch, like a Boolean or something like that. But CSS doesn't really have Booleans. It doesn't have true and false. It doesn't have on or off. But it does have what I have been advised not to call Booleans, which is sort of like fake Booleans. And I'll explain how that works. So on my root element here, I have some custom properties. I have a border thin, which is 2 pixels. I have a border thick, which is 0.25 rem, so just different widths of border. Got them as custom properties there, so I can reuse them and keep things consistent. Great. Then I have this mysterious border on property, and I use that as a multiplier with my border widths. So I have a thin and a thick class, and I multiply them each by border on. Now, n times 0 equals 0. So if you multiply anything by 0, you get 0 back, basically. If you're talking in JavaScript terms, it returns 0. N times 1, you get n. So it kind of passes through the original value. So it's like off or on, 0, 0, you know, kind of like a Boolean thing. So then if I have a no borders class, and because custom properties work with the cascade, I can do that, and have it as 0, then I begin multiplying anything within the element with no borders by 0, and so no matter what the width of the border is, I've turned it off. So I'm turning them all off simultaneously. So it's kind of a Schrodinger thing, it's kind of a quantum thing in the middle that has to happen, and it's something to do with Booleans. And so I'm getting, I was thinking about this for a long time, as I said, but I was getting somewhere when I came to this, and I do apologize for the proximity of the arrow there to the cat's anus. Moving swiftly on. So, breaking it down a bit further, we have a parent element, we have a container, okay, if we're talking in terms of container queries, and that has a variable width. It's a width we don't know because we don't know where this is going to be. It's a design system, it's modular. We don't know these things ahead of time. We're not designing for paper, right? And then we have a constant, which is our value which represents where we want things to break, where we want things to change from one layout, the horizontal one, to the other, the vertical one. And this, the variable is either going to be greater than or less than the constant. And what's really neat in CSS is no matter the width of that larger, of the container, we can always express that width as 100%. So we can do this calculation, calc 50 rem minus 100%. And that returns either a positive or a negative number. So we've kind of got our sort of switch thing there where we're either getting something which is negative or something which is positive. That's almost like 1 or 0 or true or false. But at this point, I had a kind of a mental block. I didn't know really where to take my exploratory, flexboxy, algorithm creating stuff from there. So I did what Samuel Taylor Coleridge did, and I wonder if anyone can tell me what Samuel Taylor Coleridge does when he's lacking inspiration, like for instance, just before he wrote the poem Kubla Khan. He, as Jeremy said, he's quite right, he took a fuck ton of drugs. So what I did is, no, I didn't take a lot of drugs. I'm a good middle-class white boy. So I drank the socially acceptable, arbitrarily socially acceptable equivalent, which is I drank some beer. I specifically, Tiny Rebels Stay Puffed Marshmallow Porter. Very specific, very nice actually, I recommend it. Weirdly, it actually tastes like specifically Stay Puffed marshmallows. So go and try some of them. So I had about 5, maybe 6 of those. It's quite strong. And then the next day, because I'm a bit of a lightweight and I'm in my late 30s, I was quite hungover, and I got into that weird state when you're hungover where some things become less clear, but other things become clearer. Do you know what I mean? I realized suddenly max width always beats width. So if you put max width and width on the same element, the max width will always cap the width. If the width is larger than the max width is what's returned, if you like. Similar with min width. You can't go lower than min width. So then I had my first draft of the Flexbox Holy Albatross, which looked a bit like this. So flex, display flex wrap wrap, obviously, because I want things to begin with to flow and wrap in the natural algorithmic way, the way it was designed. And then I have this multiplier, the 50 rem minus 100%. The 50 rem could be anything. Think of it like a media query. It could be any value. And 50 rem is about right. Maybe do it in CH. That's actually usually better for doing measure because it pertains to the actual letters, right, and their widths. And then I have a max width 100% and a min width 33.333% on the child elements. So my the parent sets the context, and as Rachel says, then that determines the layout of the children. Then the width is this multiplier, and then I just make it really, really, really big in either direction. So it's either a really huge positive number or a really huge negative number, just to be sure. And it gets dragged in either direction then. So you're either dragging the value, the width, down towards 33% where it will stop, or you're dragging it right up to 100% where it will stop. And so you then have turned this variable thing into this constant thing. There's probably a mathematical term for that, but I'm not a mathematician. But it's kind of normalized it in this way so that it's like on or off rather than a sliding scale. And that kind of solved it. And it's taken me 10.5 years of writing for the front end to come up with this. I always feel slightly awkward when I'm talk to people who do sort of like 3D modeling and create immersive worlds and things like that. Not interested at all, but if you can do this, oh, fuck me, yeah. You've managed to get 3 boxes to change direction. Amazing. So then I moved on to draft 2. Basically, all this was that, so Jonathan Snook, do you know Jonathan Snook, who writes very well about CSS? I think he probably spoke at a CSS day at one point. He realized that I was very hungover when I wrote this article and that I explained myself really badly. So he wrote an article about my article, slightly patronizing, but actually very helpful to a lot of people. He explained that actually this multiplier isn't needed, and he's quite right. You can just do this all in one line. You can just have the nested calculation there. And because that's the case, it now works in I11. So the Flexbox Holy Albatross, this change from one orientation to the other at a container breakpoint, that works in I11, so that's great. And this actually is very similar to something that was come up with by Rémi Parmentier. And I think this is sort of a convergent evolution thing, which sometimes happens. I was really surprised and delighted when I first saw a video that Lara was in all about CSS and algorithms, because I thought, oh, I talk about CSS and algorithms, and it felt like a sort of one of those Spider-Man pointing at each other type thing. And this was a similar thing where Rémi had already solved this problem long before me, but I had no idea that they'd done it. But it turned out that there is a need to try and fix these things, and it is surprisingly hard sometimes. But it didn't need Flexbox. None of that stuff that I just did needed Flexbox. It's just about the width and the max width. But it only works with 3 items because it's always 33%. With Flexbox, you can take it further, and you can do it with any number of children. So you have the parent, display, flex, wrap. Get rid of the max widths and min widths. Just put on flex grow 1, so everything grows, and then do flex basis is where you put the calculation. Flex basis is like the ideal value, like the aimed for value, right? And then you have a really huge negative flex basis value, and as it turns out, and Tab might be able to clarify this, but I think, or it doesn't drop the property, but I think it then treats it as 0. Right. Okay, because sometimes if it's like an invalid value, then obviously the declaration would be dropped, and then this wouldn't work. But actually, it just kind of says, no, you mean 0. So it goes to 0. So then everything just grows from 0 and stays on the same line. And then obviously, if it's a very high flex basis value, it's going to be capped at 100%, or actually, more technically, the available space. So then I can just put 4 items in horizontally at the same breakpoint. It's going to switch to a vertical orientation. And then I can do things like I can take one of the nth children and, in this case, give it flex 2. So it takes up twice as much of the available space. So then I can do this responsive layout based on a container query, no media queries, which will go directly from this layout with the larger or wider element in the middle and turn it over into a menu icon. And that looks like this. It's amazing. Right. Then there's gutters to deal with. So gutters in grid, you have grid gap, right, which is really handy. And Rachel pointed it out to me some time ago that Firefox has now implemented just gap. So gap will work in grid and in Flexbox, but that's only in Firefox at the moment. I don't think any other browsers have adopted it yet. And that just puts the space between the items, right? And that's kind of handy because it doesn't matter the orientation, you just get the space where it needs to be. There's not going to be any weird extra space on one line on one side. It'll always be symmetrical. But we can't do that currently in other browsers, so we have to do a hack, and we just use negative margins. Negative margins are a perfectly legitimate thing to use in CSS. There's nothing wrong with using it. They're not a hack. Just like Rachel was talking about the auto margins, it's not a hack thing, it's just how CSS is supposed to work. So you put a margin around everything, so the margin is symmetrical, so the margins are always going to appear in the right places no matter the wrapping. But then you have the extra margins on the other side, on either side, which is a problem, of course. So then you put another container around it, and then you just pull everything out, and then you have your kind of gap-like thing there. You've got another redundant container, but, well, actually, no, you don't have a redundant container here, but you will have to have one in a minute. I'll get onto that. So in this case, you have, because of the margins, the breakpoint, say 50 rem, isn't going to be where it was anymore. You have to remove the margin from the calculation, and then you'll get it at 50 rem or whatever it is as it was before. And as I said, you have to have a kind of a redundant wrapper to kind of insulate the negative margin, and that means that your Holy Albatross layout can then be subject to a lobotomized owl layout without you having to worry. Yeah, okay, so quantity queries. So we can take this a bit further. So at the moment, we've got a problem whereby it's great that we can just set things out as many as we want horizontally and then help them switch to being vertical. But the trouble is that there might be too many horizontal that way. There's nothing stopping an editor or someone who's adapting this interface put too many items in. Instead of them having to think about it in terms of design instead of in terms of content, we should kind of write an algorithm to make sure that that is handled automatically. And this is where quantity queries come in. So what we want to do is to display horizontally if there is more than 50 rem space or whatever it is, and if there are fewer than, let's say, 5 items. So we have these two kind of axioms which govern the thing that makes this thing work, okay? I wrote about quantity queries and talked a lot about squids. So not birds in that case. Just switch to sea life for one example on a list apart. So if you want to know like more about them, then go and read that. But very briefly, it works like this. So nth last child n plus 5 means all of the elements counting back from the end, starting with the 5th element. Not the, don't start thinking about the film. It's just about HTML elements. Okay. So in this case, on the first example here, the top one, they've got the dashed lines to show that they don't exist. So nothing gets selected because they don't exist. On the second line, there are more than 4 items. There's 6 items, which means those n plus 5 items, number 6 and number 5, do exist. And because they do exist, you can use a general sibling combinator to hook on them and then reach back and style everything. Upshot being that you can style elements within a context and all of those elements based on how many they are, hence quantity query. And we can use this in our Flexbox Holy Albatross. So if the nth last child n plus 5 exists, or there's 2, or there's an infinite number of those, then you'll get a vertical layout that is handled automatically. Your design system is governing itself. It is saying there will not be enough room for these things, so we're going to take them in a different direction. If they don't exist, then you get the horizontal layout instead. So this is kind of like algorithmic layout, right? So this has been a theme, I think, throughout this. I mean, Laura talked about it beautifully, and I think this is kind of an emerging thing maybe that's happening with CSS. And I did a video about algorithmic layouts, in fact, some time ago. I've just been doing these weird videos called Making Future Interfaces, and this is all about, it's a similar layout in this video to the Holy Albatross. It's just a sidebar thing, but it's a self-governing thing again. And I've got like a little intro to this video series to play you, just to give you a taste of what you're going to get if you go onto YouTube and check it out. So I'm just going to turn up the volume there, and here you go.
Previously on Making Future Interfaces.
It just works. Enhance.
Aha! Hoot!
Box. The C in CSS. Everything's relative, man.
Hi.
Blah, 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 blah. Disaster. The square, the fast square, the sass and less.
Pixel perfection.
Rest in peace. Yeah. Boy.
I think that's fairly self-explanatory, right? I don't think we need to sort of... So if you're on YouTube and you want to like go and learn about about how to do web stuff, choose someone else, I guess, maybe. I mean, I just did take out all of the stupid bits. There is information in there as well. I got complaints from people because they were saying, they went, I was really excited about what you were saying about inline SVG, but I had to watch this really long video of someone falling to their death from a hot air balloon first. It's like, oh, sorry. Yeah, okay, so now custom elements and design systems. So I've got my Flexbox Holy Albatross thing. How does it get into my design system? Well, I like to use custom elements, and the reason for that is because they are increasingly getting supported, partly because Chromium is now consuming Edge like a snake eating a large egg. And which means we'll get all of that stuff along with it. We'll get the custom element stuff, get a lot of the CSS stuff, which is not currently supported in Edge or in old Edge. And custom elements can be interoperable. We can get them to work with different stacks and different technologies. So going back to what Brad was saying, it's about making things which you can use across your different products and across your different teams, which is great. So I can have a Holy Albatross thing a bit like this. I might just zoom in, actually. That's better. So this takes a couple of props. So I've got a switch prop. That's where I set my container breakpoint, and I set the margin inside the Holy Albatross. It will work out how to deal with that margin. It will use calc or something to create the negative margins and things like that. So that's taken care of by the author of the page. And the cool thing is I can drop this into Vue or something like that, or in Preact, or I can drop it in Markdown and it'll work. Need to set some getters and setters inside the custom element definition so that the props can be dynamically changed from inherited application state and so on. That's what it looks like in Vue. There's a syntax with a colon there, and the arbitrarily different Preact, your users aren't going to know the difference. Looks a bit like this. So that brings us on to things that suck ass, number one. For my money, JSDOM kind of sucks ass, because specifically in this case, if I'm using JSDOM to define my Flexbox Holy Albatross, and I'm writing my styles into the shadow root, I have to use slots to open up windows into the light DOM again. So those child elements that I'm going to be placing in the Holy Albatross, they're light DOM, and I'll have to be styling them from within the shadow DOM. And that means using this slotted syntax, right? And for very good reason in terms of performance and other compatibility reasons, I would imagine, you can't do an awful lot with slots. So you can't reach into a light DOM slot and then style nested elements there. It will only let you do it to one level. You also can't kind of style between slots. You can't use like the adjacent sibling thing there. So I can't do my quantity query stuff in this case. So what I decided to do was to throw away Shadow DOM, in fact. And instead, I wrote something else. I did a thing where basically I turned all of the values for my props into a string. I dynamically created a kind of an identifier from that. And then I would just build a style sheet and embed it into the page. And that would go into the head of the page, and that would be what styled my Holy Albatross. But critically, the string represents that configuration of props. It's not, it's more efficient than actually creating a style sheet for each individual instance of a Holy Albatross. It feels weird saying that all the time, just saying Holy Albatross over and over again. And if it's weird for me, it's probably even weirder for you. Okay, and so the first Holy Albatross that mounts onto the page therefore creates the style sheet, and each successive one is like, we don't need to create our own style sheet, we'll just use this one. So it's kind of hopefully quite efficient. And this is kind of what it looks like. I'm using a data attribute and attribute selectors to actually create the relationship between the component itself and the styles. And now for some initialisms, SSR with JSDOM. So server-side rendering, obviously that's a good thing. It's great that a lot of us are moving more towards using server-side rendering rather than doing everything on the client, building everything on the client. And I've just recently discovered this enormous hammer that I can use for a lot of this, and it's called JSDOM. It's the JavaScript implementation of the document object model. And what I can do is, it's a specific fork of this, in fact. The main trunk of JSDOM doesn't support this yet, but this fork supports custom elements, which means I can get my custom elements to run on the server, create those styles, put them into the head, and then send that all statically. And what that means, I should say, the way I specifically do this is using something called Eleventy, which is a really nice static site generator. It has something called transforms, so hence this function add transform that allows me to post-process the HTML. So I will be compiling typically from, say, Markdown into HTML, and then this will actually then allow another step in that HTML, and inside there I can run JSDOM, run those scripts, and write those styles from my custom elements. Which effectively meant that for these layout components in my design system, like the Holy Albatross and others, they actually work without JavaScript at all. In fact, the only reason JavaScript is there is so that I can dynamically change those styles once everything has hit the client. And actually, a lot of the time, that's not even going to happen. So really using custom elements was really just a way of making it easier to author in HTML layouts. And this is a site which I'm launching now. This is brand new, that deals with Holy Albatross and everything more or less else to do with CSS layout. This is something that I've been working on with Andy Bell. And it's basically a collection of these little custom elements, these what I call layout primitives, that help you, will hopefully help you, or probably not you, probably more likely your colleagues who are a bit more CSS agnostic, to understand CSS and understand how you can use simple composable layouts to make things. This is my hotel room floor. That was a medicine jar full of sweets. I realized there was something wrong with this site, which we were just launching today, so I ran back to my hotel, jumped onto the desk and smashed this and cut my foot. So this is how important this website is to me. That's sort of what it looks like. There's some of the little layouts. There's sort of, they're in pictorial form there. And you get sort of interactive demos which show you how everything comes together. That's something to do with grid. I've got these little utility components like which do like fake text and things like that. So hopefully you'll find it kind of an interesting thing to look at. Things that suck ass, number 2. This will be a controversial thing to say in most conferences, but I suspect not at CSS Day. React actually sucks ass. And I'll explain why React sucks ass. It's not very compatible with HTML, as it turns out. So basically, custom elements are, they're native. They are actually the native form of kind of component, and your frameworks can consume them. So Vue actually is very good at just consuming custom elements. You can just put custom elements into your Vue stuff, and they kind of work. They work together. Preact is very good as well. React, not so good, and that's mostly due to the synthetic event system, which basically means that you have to go back to using refs and add event listeners. So you go away, if you want to use custom elements in React, you have to hack around a lot, and you end up going away from being declarative, which is sort of defeats the whole point of doing anything in React, right? Which is a bit of a shame. And I don't get what Brad has from people who do React, where they just say React at him. They're more specific. They say hooks at me when they try and explain why I should care about React. I say hooks, and I'm not listening, hooks, and so on, like that. Until eventually I just fall to the floor, roll out of the room, and disappear. So just a little thought experiment before I go. I want you to, so this is like one of those philosophy, you've probably seen ones like this before. This is like one of these philosophy things, like a moral dilemma. So here is a train, and obviously this is a Facebook train, and this is on a train track. You've seen trains before. It's like a Trump train. In fact, Facebook's literally like a Trump train. And so this goes along here, and if you don't interfere with it and you just leave it where it is, you get React forever. They'll keep throwing money at React. I think they've got a static site generator called Gatsby now. They put like 800 billion pounds into that static site generator. You'll just get loads of talented people. They'll keep employing them, and you'll keep getting React maintained and improved, and it'll get better and better and better. But, and you probably saw this coming, along the track there's a switch, right? Now, if you press the switch, what happens is that Facebook goes off course, goes onto a different track, goes into the sea, explodes, goes into the sea. It's all over, it gets consumed by sharks, okay? Now, the critical thing to understand here is that if Facebook goes, so does React. You don't have React anymore. So you've got to ask yourself, do I care that much about React that I'd want Facebook, which is terrible, to continue to exist? As a British person, this is actually a really easy decision, and I'll tell you why. Because here is Brexit. Facebook literally facilitated Brexit by poisoning, using or allowing targeted advertising, the brains of the infirm. So if Facebook dies, so does Brexit, but so does React. So, if you don't like React, it's a no-brainer, obviously. So there's that. So I'm just going to finish on a few comments now. Obviously, I wrote about the Holy Albatross online. I got some interesting comments from people. Seriously, you prefer to use this solution instead of a simple media query? Yes, you obviously didn't read the fucking article. Patrick, you fucking dickhead. Lars Fay came in and has pontificated that this writer, that's me, is either extremely bored, narcissistic, or a sadist. So I'm assuming that Lars has led a sheltered life. He's never actually met a sadist. But I did get some positive comments as well. This is a lovely comment left by Mark, who is almost certainly a real person, who's written, love this, no punctuation, recommend, myschooltutorial.com. So instead of coming up to me after this talk to talk about this more, I don't know anymore, I've put it all in the talk. I recommend you go to, Mark obviously has this covered. So I recommend you go to his website, my school tutorial, where you will find some awesome e-learning. And that's everything I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.